admitting.
Hi, Jesse.
Hello.
Hello, Carolyn.
Hi.
We'll just give it one more minute in case there's any stragglers, and then we'll get going. There we go. We have one more. And then I think once he's in and connected, we will get started. Hi, Randy. Thanks for joining us. Hi, Randy. Thanks for joining us. Sorry, you weren't connected, I think.
Yeah. Okay,
nice to see you. Okay, so I'm just going to remind everyone to please keep their microphones on mute, but at any time, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions or answer any of the questions that I'm going to ask today. I'd like our workshop to be more conversational and interactive, if you folks are willing. And also we have Heather here with us today to manage the chat box and make sure that I'm keeping on top of any questions that anyone has. So please feel free to enter anything that you would like to know in the chat box as well. So I am Michelle. I'm the program manager here at Independent Living Nova Scotia for our RISE program, which is a transitional program for youth who identify as having disabilities. And we do employment skills training. So today we're going to talk about healthy boundaries and self-care in relation to our social series about how to connect with others and take care of ourselves during the pandemic. So we're going to talk about what boundaries are, why we need them, how to set them, how to identify our needs, and then we're going to talk about I statements as a way to communicate our boundaries effectively with others. We're also going to talk about self-care, which is a boundary, and they are very interconnected, you'll learn, because we need boundaries to take care of ourselves, and we need self-care to set boundaries. So we're going to talk about what self-care is, how boundaries are self-care, how to know when you need a boundary to support your self-care, and consequences of low self-care, like burnout. We're also gonna have a little discussion at the end specific to COVID-19 and our boundaries in self-care and how they've been affected by the pandemic. I would first like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kmaq, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Our ability to gather is a result of the peace and friendship treaties of the 1750s and 1760s that affirm Indigenous sovereignty. We are privileged to be able to live, work, and play on this land as Nova Scotians. So, what are boundaries? Boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify for themselves what are reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave around them, and how they will respond when someone steps outside those limits. So we are going to go in some detail about boundaries, but basically, boundaries are what's okay and what's not okay. Here's an example of a boundary that we've probably all seen: no trespassing. If you violate that boundary, there will be a consequence. But this type of boundary is easy to understand because you can see the sign. Personal boundaries can be harder to define because they are invisible, they can change, and they're unique to each individual. So there are many different types of boundaries. So if we look to the diagram I have here, there are physical boundaries, which are relating to personal space and physical touch. So what's appropriate and what's not appropriate based on the type of relationship. Emotional boundaries refer to respecting feelings or putting limits on how much personal information you want to share with someone and when you want to share that information. And again, all of these boundaries are going to be specific to specific relationships that we have. Intellectual boundaries refer to respecting the thoughts and ideas of ourselves and of others, and also having awareness of what is an appropriate thing to discuss with certain people. Sexual boundaries take the physical, emotional, and intellectual boundaries and relate them to our sexuality. So we may have physical, emotional, or intellectual boundaries related to our sexuality, and those can look really different for each person and each relationship. It's also important to have boundaries around our time, how we use our time, or how much time we're willing to give others. And this is where self-care comes in, because making time for our own needs is also really important. So it's making time for all aspects of your life before attending to the needs of others. And this can be really challenging, and we're going to talk about this in detail later on. There's also boundaries we might have around money and possessions. So these are material boundaries. So setting limits on what you want to share and with whom. Persons with disabilities may have specific boundaries that they need to set. Sometimes there could be a boundary around a mobility or assistive device. Sometimes there could be a boundary with when a person may need or want to accept help from others. Sometimes a person with a disability will need support, which may look different or be specific to their needs. And often others may not consider these specific and unique needs. So boundaries can be really important to express to others if we have a very specific and unique need that we need met. So why is it important to set boundaries at all? as we're going to learn in the workshop, it helps us practice self-care. Boundaries are self-care. They're a way that we can take care of ourselves and respect ourselves and our needs. It's also important to set boundaries to communicate your needs in a relationship. Oftentimes, we think that our friends and family are able to read our minds or that they should know us well enough to know what we want. But usually, those needs need to be communicated. We want to set limits in the relationship in a healthy way and communicate those needs effectively. And we're going to learn that here today. It's also important to set boundaries to make time and space for positive interactions. And that's where self-care is going to come in. Creating healthy boundaries is really empowering. By recognizing the need to set and enforce limits, you're protecting your self-esteem, maintaining your self-respect, and enjoying healthy relationships. So I really like this image over here because it illustrates really well how conflicting and challenging it can be to set boundaries, especially with certain people in our lives. So sometimes the first step in setting healthy boundaries is setting a boundary and then feeling totally conflicted about it. So you may have feelings like, I shouldn't have set that boundary. I'm awful. And then your thoughts may move to, no, I'm not. I needed that boundary. I'm strong and awesome. And then quickly you might move to, no, I'm not. I'm horrible and I do horrible things. Healthy boundaries get easier in time, and it's much more beneficial to set a boundary than not to. And we're going to see why as we move through the slides. So, what can happen if we don't? Unhealthy boundaries can cause emotional pain. They can lead to dependency, always being in our heads about what others in our life may want or need, or expectations that we have about them or about ourselves in that relationship. Not having boundaries can also lead to depression, because if our needs are constantly not being met, that can make us feel all kinds of negative feelings, which can bring us down overall and affect our quality of life and ability to be happy and feel fulfilled. Not having boundaries can also create a lot of anxiety. Oftentimes, we'll know we need a boundary if we're stressing out about this person. What are they going to ask me? How is our interaction going to go? What should I say? What should I do? This kind of anxiety can cause a lot of stress and strain on our relationships. And if we don't have strong boundaries or struggle with our boundaries, sometimes this stress can even cause physical illness. There are a lot of physical manifestations of stress, and we're going to go into detail about those in a little bit. Just think about it this way. A lack of boundaries is like leaving the door to your home unlocked. Anyone, including unwelcome guests, can come and go as they please. You need to be the person to close and sometimes lock the door. Being able to lock the door is about knowing your limits. And sometimes when we're creating boundaries, we take it too far, and our boundaries can become too rigid. Having too many boundaries can lead to isolation. It can make it hard to connect with others and for them to connect with us. Sometimes when we have these rigid boundaries, we can avoid close relationships altogether. We're also unlikely to ask for help when we need it, and can be very protective of personal information, not wanting to share with others, and therefore not getting that intimacy that we want in our relationships. Also, it can cause a fear of rejection. Rigid boundaries are not healthy. They're demands which alienate and isolate you and support the illusion that you're superior. So I threw around a couple of terms, soft and rigid boundaries, and now we're going to talk about the different kinds of boundaries. So soft boundaries, if you're a person who has soft boundaries, you will have difficulty identifying your boundaries at all and difficulty setting boundaries with others. Not having strong boundaries can lead to psychological manipulation. Unfortunately, there are people in the world who are going to take advantage of your lack of boundaries. Additionally, soft boundaries also make it easier to become really enmeshed with others. This kind of codependency in a relationship looks like always putting someone else's needs before your own, or always worrying what that person might think about you or what they might be needing or wanting. Going back to rigid boundaries, these people tend to put up walls instead of boundaries. They struggle to soften those boundaries when they lose trust. So people who have issues with trust because they've been hurt in the past might put up these walls, but then it's really hard to take those down and begin to trust people. And it can be hard to grow in life and in relationships if we have these huge walls that we feel are protecting us, but are really preventing us from having strong, healthy relationships. People with rigid boundaries keep others at a distance, they feel, to protect themselves. Kind of in the middle between soft and rigid is spongy. Now, people with spongy boundaries use a combination of soft and rigid boundaries, which is very confusing, not only for themselves, but for others. You might be someone with spongy boundaries if you have a hard time identifying your boundaries at all. People with spongy boundaries tend to be guarded emotionally from others and also really inconsistent, which can be difficult for other people when trying to maintain a relationship because they never know what they're going to get with you. Ideally, we want to aim to have flexible boundaries, which is a kind of a combination. Flexible boundaries allow you to communicate your boundaries fairly easily. Having flexible boundaries means you can adjust your boundaries based on different situations. So you know yourself well enough to adjust and adapt your boundaries to different situations. Also, you have a good sense of control over your own inner space and your wants and needs. So now that we understand a little bit about boundaries, let's talk about some of the barriers to boundary setting, because of course, setting boundaries is incredibly difficult. It may seem obvious that no one would want their boundaries violated, but the truth is our boundaries are violated all the time. And sometimes we're violating other people's boundaries too, whether we mean to or not. So why do we allow it? Why do we not enforce or uphold our boundaries more strongly? Well, there are a lot of reasons for this. Sometimes it's as simple as a fear of confrontation. Having conversations about boundaries is really challenging and scary, especially with certain people in our lives. So that fear of confrontation can be really holding us back from setting a boundary that might be really important for our own well-being. Sometimes we might feel guilty about setting a boundary. This happens a lot when we're setting boundaries around personal care and self-care, because we might feel like we're being selfish by taking care of ourselves instead of someone else. A lot of the times, we're not taught what healthy boundaries look like. And so it can be really difficult to set them when we have no context or no knowledge about what healthy boundaries look like. And sometimes it's simply a matter of safety, and we feel like it could compromise our safety to set this boundary at all. People with disabilities may struggle with boundaries for additional reasons and for many different reasons, since disability is so unique to the person. Sometimes there's a need to allow care workers into personal space. So we may have to have separate boundaries for care workers than we would for others around our physical space. Sometimes an intellectual disability may make it hard to communicate a specific need with people in your life. Difficulty with social interaction and communication can make these difficult conversations even harder. Having healthy boundaries will allow you to have higher self-esteem and self-respect. Will protect physical and emotional space from intrusion. So when we think about the metaphor of the house and the types of boundaries we talked about earlier, there's physical and emotional space that sometimes is being compromised when our boundaries are not strong enough. Healthy boundaries also allow you to be more assertive in your life and confidently and truthfully say yes or no. But boundaries are also about being okay when others say no to you. We can't set our own boundaries and expect other people to respect them if we aren't going to respect theirs. We all have to have boundaries, and everyone's boundaries need to be respected. Healthy boundaries also allow you to separate your needs, thoughts, feelings, and desires from others, and recognize that your boundaries and needs are different from others. Everyone's going to have their own unique boundaries. Healthy boundaries also allow you to empower yourself to make healthy choices and take responsibility for your own needs. I see something in the chat there, so maybe we'll take a minute.
Yes, we received a question from Carolyn. Carolyn asks, are these boundaries, the 4 in the graphic, in the circles, representative of both personal and professional categories? So could you have rigid boundaries at work and in a personal relationship, or would they be different?
That's a great question, Carolyn. Thank you so much for asking. I think it's really personal. And I think it depends on the type of job that you have and how comfortable you feel at your job. But I think boundaries are all about adaptability and being able to adapt not only to the different situation as in work or personal life, but to the relationship you have with the person you're setting boundaries with and the specific situation. So maybe you usually have flexible boundaries at work, but there's a couple of areas where you're like, nope, absolutely not. This is a hard no for me, rigid boundary. And that can be the same for relationships too. I hope that answers your question.
Could I speak to that as well, Michelle?
Absolutely, yeah.
I just would also like to note that there are lots of jobs where the boundaries are required. For example, there may be jobs where you can't share personal information with clients. Or it may be that, in a specific job, you have to act a certain way or keep, more personal info close to your chest, confidential for whatever reason. But in other jobs, for example, massage therapy, a physical boundary might be crossed in a way other jobs it absolutely wouldn't, because it's also about trust in maybe the person who has, a certification or a degree in something that can help you.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was a really great answer. So just feel free to interrupt me if there's anything else in the chat. And thank you for that question, Carolyn. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what unhealthy boundaries look like, so we can start to think about ourselves and areas where we may have boundaries that we have to work on. So an unhealthy boundary could be sharing too much information too soon, or alternatively, closing yourself off and not expressing your needs or wants at all. So those are two opposite things, and both are unhealthy boundaries. Boundaries are really about finding the balance. An inability to say no for fear of rejection, that's unhealthy. We need to be able to say no when it's important for our own well-being. Unhealthy boundaries can also be basing how you feel about yourself on how others treat you. And general disempowerment, so allowing others to make decisions for you. The consequences of this is that you feel powerless and don't take your responsibility for your own life. So here in this image, you'll see there's 4 different types. And these kind of go a little bit, they coincide with the soft, rigid, spongy, and flexible. This is just another way of thinking about it.
We have a question in the chat.
Sure.
Jessie would like to know what you would do if you set your boundaries, but the person you try to set them with doesn't respect or listen.
That's a good question, Jessie. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the ways to communicate effectively, but ultimately, setting a boundary needs to have a consequence. So when we set a boundary, we need to be clear with the other person that this is really important to me. And if you keep crossing this boundary, it is going to jeopardize our relationship. And that's the consequence. And even if that's someone that we are related to, for example, sometimes we need to set really rigid boundaries with people in our life who are toxic. And it can be really hard, but there needs to be a consequence for people crossing your boundaries. Otherwise, what's the point of making a boundary at all? So I'll talk about that a little bit further into the slides. And then if you want to ask the question again or gain more clarification after I talk about the ways to communicate and how to set up consequences, then we can chat about that. So going back to unhealthy boundaries, a passive boundary is saying others' rights and needs take place over mine. So that might be like soft boundaries. Or passive aggressive, I subtly make clear that my rights prevail. So these are kind of spongy, right? You're not really saying for sure. You're kind of assuming that people are going to know what your boundaries are. Aggressive boundaries are kind of like rigid boundaries. I boldly insist that my rights and needs prevail. And the green over here, or assertive, is most like flexible. So I clearly express that we both have rights and needs. And as we move through the slides, we'll start to understand how to set boundaries in a way that's respectful to yourself, but also to others. So let's get into it. Tips for setting healthy boundaries. So you want to be clear, calm, firm, and respectful. You want to set them when you're ready, not when someone else tells you to. And it's okay to say to someone, you know, I'm really not sure how I feel about that and need more time to process this. Number 3, never justify your need for a boundary. You don't have to explain yourself at all. This can be really hard, especially with certain people in our life where we feel like we have to justify why we're setting this boundary. But you are setting the boundary for you and you don't need to explain yourself. Also, number 4, you don't need to apologize for setting the boundary. And if we go back to number 1, be clear, calm, and firm and respectful. Try not to get angry or let too much emotion get into the conversation, because when we get escalated and emotional, the other person is going to become defensive and we're going to get too emotional and we're going to forget about how to set a boundary and communicate it clearly and effectively. You are not responsible for the other person's reaction to the boundary you're setting. You are only responsible for communicating your boundary in a respectful way. If your boundary upsets them, that's their problem. It's helpful sometimes, because we know these conversations are hard, to run through a few examples of what might happen or scenarios in your head beforehand and just plan what you might say if that person does react negatively to the boundary that you're setting. But remember to establish your boundary clearly, communicate it clearly, and then honor your boundary. So going back to that idea of, I'm setting this, it's important to me, and there will be a consequence if it isn't respected. So you have rights in this situation, and it's important to remember these when setting boundaries. Setting emotional and physical boundaries keep everyone safe. Healthy boundaries are firm and flexible at the same time. You have the right to need things, and sometimes people are not going to be able to meet your needs. You have the right to make your own choices. Sometimes people will not like your choices. You have the right to put yourself first. Self-care is not self-indulgent. And healthy boundaries provide separateness that's necessary for independence and having your own identity. And you have the right to have your own identity. So, how to set personal boundaries? First, on your own, you want to define the boundary. Identify what it is that you need. Then, communicate it. Stay simple. Don't over-explain. Remember, you don't have to. And then set a consequence. Say why it's important and what will happen if it's not respected. So let's go into this a bit further. Using I statements is a great way to communicate your boundaries clearly and respectfully. So here's an example of an effective way to communicate using an I statement. I feel violated when you read my journal because I value my privacy. What I need is a space that's private to record my thoughts. So if you had a rigid boundary, you might say something like, keep your hands off my journal, which is angry and not really setting a boundary or explaining why it's important to you. So it is less likely to be respected by the person you're talking to. So let's break down an effective I statement. So you start by saying, I feel, and then you put your emotion in there. So violated. When you, so this is what the other person has done to cause this feeling. So when you read my journal, because, now this is important, we want to say how it impacted you, because I value my privacy. And then you want to say what you need to feel better or to forgive what the person has done. I need a private place to record my thoughts. So bringing this back to self-care, boundaries are part of self-care. They help us maintain good mental and emotional health. They help us be autonomous and develop our own identity. And they help us avoid burnout, which is what happens when we don't practice self-care. So what is self-care? Self-care is the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's health, but it's also taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness, especially during times of stress. So you can see here in this little image, it says, take care of yourself so you have the space to take care of others. Self-care can be really challenging for people who are caregivers. If you have someone in your life that you are responsible for taking care of, it can be really hard to put your needs before that person. But if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to take care of them. So how do you know when you need a boundary? You might feel guilty or worried about setting the boundary at all, about the specific person or the relationship, or about how you feel without the boundary. You feel stressed, anxious, or irritable. Sometimes a lack of boundaries in one area can cause us to lash out in other areas. You rate the needs of others as higher than your own needs. Self-care is about putting yourself first when you need to. This is for emotional and physical needs. Or you find it difficult to make decisions. This is a good marker for needing a boundary. These are just a few. There are many more things you may think or feel that can help you determine where you need a boundary. So we talked a little bit about what happens when we don't have boundaries. Burnout is something that happens when we don't have boundaries and we're not taking care of ourselves. So burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion, which is caused by excessive and prolonged stress. So this is not just a day or even a week. This has been going on for a long time, and it's really starting to take a toll. There are a lot of emotional and physical symptoms. I won't go into all of them, but you can see here the list is very, very long. Things like exhaustion, difficulty sleeping, lowered immune system, right? You're getting sick all the time, you're run down. Anxiety, lack of creativity, loss of purpose. Also, burnout at work looks a little different. You might feel that every day at work is a bad day. You might feel exhausted much of the time. You may have no joy or interest in your work or even feel depressed by it. You may feel overwhelmed by your responsibilities, have less patience for others, feel generally hopeless about life and work, experience some of those physical symptoms I talked about, or have the Sunday night blues because you're so worried about going to work the next day. Also, when we're burnt out, we tend to complain a lot. and feel really depleted. So it's important for our self-care to make sure that we're checking our battery every day. Check in with yourself and ask, how am I feeling? So up at the top, we have feeling great. You keep meeting your needs, you're practicing self-care, you're setting your boundaries, you're doing really well. Feeling good. How can you maintain these levels that you're at? If you're just feeling okay, think about how you can make your day a tiny bit better. If you're feeling less than okay, on this diagram, they called it meh, which I like. How can you love yourself today or be extra kind to yourself? If you identify as struggling, this is where you need to be careful and practice triage. What area of your life is suffering the most right now, and what can you do about it by taking small steps to make it better? Or do you need to ask for help? And at the bottom, when it says I'm empty, this is where we need to really worry about burnout being a real possibility. You need to pinpoint what's draining you and try to create a boundary and then do something to fill yourself back up so you feel better. So there are a million ways to practice self-care, and they're really different for everybody. But ultimately, it's doing things that bring you joy. What makes you happy and what makes you feel fulfilled? It's important to do something every day that brings you joy. Remember to get enough sleep, and remember to rest and relax. This is different than sleep, right? We want to make sure we're doing something that we can get really into and that makes us feel calm inside and happy. Make sure we're maintaining healthy relationships, which boundaries can help with. Keeping track of our fitness and nutrition is also really important for self-care. And practicing gratitude. Even on your lowest days, try to find something that you're grateful for. You can see in the image over here, a lot of the things that are identified as self-care are boundaries. Spending time alone, that's a boundary. Putting yourself first, that's a boundary. Saying no or staying at home when you don't feel like going out, those are boundaries. So in closing, I'd like to ask a few questions about COVID-19 and boundaries and self-care. So I'm going to leave these questions up, but I'll read them out as well. What are some examples of boundaries that came about during COVID for you? What kinds of boundaries are hard to set during COVID? How has COVID made it easier or harder to set and keep your boundaries? And in what ways has COVID affected your self-care?
So Carolyn spoke up in here and mentioned social distancing, that keeping people at least 6 feet away helped, especially with close talkers, so people who like to get all up in your business. I actually just said something similar, saying that I found COVID made it easier to practice physical boundaries because we were all literally apart. You know, I find now when I am greeting people in person, you know, before this third lockdown, we're not shaking hands anymore. There tends to be a bit of a moment of us checking in with one another about what we're comfortable with. And that's nice to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for those comments. I agree. It's been easier to set physical boundaries, but I've also noticed with one of my very close friends, we had different ideas about what rules could be broken and what rules couldn't during COVID. And it was a difficult conversation I had to have with one of my friends to be like, listen, you might be comfortable with this, but I'm really not. And I need to respect what I'm feeling right now and my fear or or however I'm feeling about the pandemic. And you know what? I don't think that we should hang out, or let's go for a walk instead of to a restaurant, right? And those kinds of conversations are kind of new because this is something that we haven't had to deal with before. So I think in some ways COVID has brought about boundaries that are totally new, and it's these new conversations that we have to navigate that can be really challenging.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I have a similar situation, Michelle. I have a friend of mine. Actually, I have a bubble, like I think I told you, my daughter and her partner. But there's this friend of mine that I have to, like, it's an area where I have to walk, and he works, and it's a good parking lot. There's nobody around. So sometimes I'll walk there. And I had to say it several times, like, he got close, and I kept telling him to back off. Like, I had to get, but I think it was, at first he was very upset. And I said, this is the, what's going on with COVID. So you have to keep saying it maybe several times, but say it in a nice way. Not say back off, but I think people eventually get it and understand and appreciate it. And so I don't think it's, I just wanted to mention that it's sort of a similar story. So I think it's just saying it in a nice way, and, and I think people get the message eventually. Yeah. And
Yeah.
hopefully it won't harm the friendship in any way. So.
Right.
So.
Thank you for sharing that, Randy. I feel like COVID's been a little bit of a progression, right? Like at the beginning, we were like, whoa, there's all these new strong rules, and we were all a bit worried. And then in between the waves, we kind of got a little more lax maybe, and let our boundaries get a little softer.
Yeah.
And I think we just kind of have to ride it. And again, like boundaries are all about being adaptable and like assessing each situation and each relationship.
Yes. Absolutely. Good point.
Carolyn spoke up again in the chat here to offer that the boundary of how seriously we all want to comply with rules can be tough. That some friends, even in different provinces, so for example, with Carolyn, it was Alberta, teased her about how hardcore she was with the safety precautions she was taking. So, clearly, even in different places where messaging may be different or attitudes may be different, it can be a challenge that way. She's saying they were eating in restaurants in Alberta and she was wearing gloves and a mask to go to the store.
Right.
And I think that's also a good example of, how to keep strong in your boundaries when people are making you feel ridiculed or feel silly for wanting to feel safe. That's definitely a challenge.
Absolutely.
I offered a little bit earlier there in the chat that sometimes working remotely can make it challenging to actually create good boundaries with work. For example, knowing when to clock in or out. If some people, used to go into the physical workplace, it might have been easier to set those times or limits. But being right in your space, it might be tougher to set those boundaries for yourself.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you for that. I definitely have found that self-care has been a whole different thing, because some of the things that we might be used to doing for our self-care, we haven't been able to do during COVID. So again, it's that adaptability and trying to figure out what do I need and how can I get it, and how can I ask people in my life to support me in reaching these needs, when we're kind of all really limited sometimes on what we're able to do, and some of our favorite things we may not be able to do. But also, I learned some new things that I can do for my self-care that don't cost any money or require me to leave my house that I hadn't really considered before. So, there are some definite learning that came out of COVID, and some things that could be beneficial too. Anything else that anyone wants to share?
Carolyn mentioned here that self-care is difficult for folks who have developed or noticed things that maybe have popped up for the first time during lockdown. For example, some friends experiencing isolation for the first time. I really appreciate that addition too, because I think for some people who live with disabilities, they're seeing people take precautions that they've been taking for years. Whether that's having to wear masks because they've had poor immune response, people who have physical disabilities that keep them in their homes a lot of the time, or people who are now able to work from home when they weren't allowed just for their own disability before. A lot of changes in accessibility coming up that wasn't offered to people with disabilities before necessarily, or people who never had these experiences.
Absolutely. Great point. Thank you so much for all your contributions.
So, yeah, so I went walking this weekend down public gardens. So I'm just, as far as like boundary, it was very difficult to walk. I mean, I need to keep active. I mean, it's something that, but I need to do it in a safe manner these days with COVID. So again, it's like, that's why I go to this parking lot, but I actually tried to go to public gardens, and it was a bit stressful because there was a lot of people there. I mean, it was outside, but a lot of people were getting close. They had no masks. Some people, I say 10% of the people in the park had 20% had masks on, but the others didn't. So it was a very stressful situation because there's a lot of people that were just walking and not really paying attention, being inches away from people. And so, I need my physical exercise, but I need to do it in a safe manner these days. So it's a bit difficult. And of course, with the gym closed as well, it makes it even harder. So. Yeah.
For sure. Thank you, Randy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for all of your great insights and contributions to the conversation. It was a real pleasure. If you have any additional questions or want to reach out to me for any reason, I've just put my email. Oh, that's wrong. Sorry. It's actually msayers@ilns.ca, not at Gmail. So sorry about that.
I just typed that in the chat here.
Thank you so much.
And I'll just add, we got a final comment here from Jesse that I think is a great way to note that we don't even know who's all downloaded the COVID alert app, and so for, you're out in the world, who knows who has it, and that's helping keep us safe too. So definitely a good reminder that even though technology is there to help keep us safe, if not everyone's using it, then how effective is it really?
Absolutely. Good point, Jesse. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And if anyone would like a copy of this or the PDFs, we will have those available, and feel free to reach out. Thank you so much, everyone. And we do have one more workshop coming up on Tuesday with Caitlin, and we hope to see you there as well.
Okay. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
That's good. Thanks, Heather.